Ladies and gentlemen, in the United States military, almost everything leaves a record. Orders are logged, missions are coded, after-action reports are filed. Even failures are documented, studied, and archived. But history tells us something unsettling. There are missions that don't exist on paper. No official name, no public briefing, no archived report. Tonight, we examine one of those missions, a U.S. military operation remembered by people but missing from records. During periods of global tension, World War II, the Cold War, and the early years of modern counterterrorism, the United States authorized operations that demanded absolute secrecy. These missions were not designed for medals or headlines. They were designed to be deniable, temporary, and in some cases, forgettable by design. Veterans have spoken quietly years later. They describe rapid deployments with minimal notice, aircraft that flew without standard markings, units reassigned on paper but not in reality. When they returned, there were no debriefings in the traditional sense, no follow-up paperwork, just orders to move on. In official archives, historians later noticed gaps. A unit listed as inactive during a time witnesses recall it operating overseas. Supply shipments logged without destination. Budget entries that don't match any known mission. These inconsistencies raised a difficult question. How could a modern military lose track of its own operations? The answer may lie in how these missions were authorized. Some were approved verbally under emergency powers. Others were folded into broader programs, their identities dissolved into larger classified efforts. In certain cases, records were intentionally destroyed to protect sources, methods, or diplomatic relationships that could not survive public exposure. And sometimes missions vanished because the outcome demanded silence. If an operation failed in hostile territory, if lives were lost without clear accountability, if international law hovered in a gray zone, the safest option was no record at all. For decades, these missions lived only in memory. A pilot who was told never to log his flight. A ground operator who received no citation, no acknowledgement. Families who never fully understood where their loved ones had gone, or why official answers never came. This absence of records does not mean the mission was imaginary. It means it was considered too dangerous to remember. In recent years, partial declassifications have revealed how common this practice once was. Files released with entire pages blacked out, project names without descriptions. References to operations not otherwise identified. Even now, historians believe there are missions that will never be fully documented, not because the truth doesn't exist, but because it was sealed away deliberately. The United States military prides itself on accountability, structure, and documentation. Yet its history also includes moments when secrecy outweighed transparency, when national security demanded that an operation be erased, not celebrated. So when we say this U.S. military mission has no records, we're not talking about a mistake. We're talking about a choice. A decision made in the shadows during a time when silence was considered safer than history. And somewhere, in memories that were never written down, that mission still exists. Thank you. The silence in the archives is not accidental, and it is not rare. In a nation that records nearly every military action with precision, the absence of documentation speaks as loudly as any classified file. The United States military is built on structure, procedure, and accountability. Orders are written, copied, transmitted, and preserved. Missions are assigned numbers. Units are tracked, timelines are established, yet within this vast system of documentation, there are moments where the trail simply ends. Historians working inside military archives have long noted these gaps. They appear as missing folders, unexplained jumps in unit activity, or references to operations that lead nowhere. A report might mention a deployment that officially never happened. A veteran service record may show a period of inactivity that contradicts eyewitness accounts. Budget documents sometimes reveal funding movements without corresponding operational explanations. These are not clerical errors repeated once or twice. They form patterns. During major conflicts, especially when time-sensitive decisions were made under extreme pressure, documentation was sometimes deliberately minimized. In certain cases, orders were issued verbally and never reduced to writing. In others, written records existed only briefly before being reclassified, relocated, or destroyed. The intent was simple. If a mission could not be traced, it could not be exposed. The Cold War intensified this practice. As intelligence agencies and military units operated in a world divided by ideology, secrecy became a weapon. Operations conducted near or within hostile territories carried enormous political risk. If uncovered, they could escalate conflicts or undermine diplomatic efforts. As a result, some missions were designed to leave no trace in publicly accessible archives. They were compartmentalized so tightly that even within the military, only a handful of individuals knew their full scope. This created a historical paradox. The most sensitive missions were often the least documented, not because they were insignificant, but because their significance made them dangerous to record. When historians later examined official timelines, they encountered unexplained pauses. Units appeared dormant while evidence suggested otherwise. Aircraft logs showed training flights during periods when witnesses recalled operational missions. The archives, usually so meticulous, fell silent. That silence also affected accountability. Without records, there could be no official acknowledgement. Soldiers who participated in these missions often returned to routine assignments as if nothing had happened. There were no citations, no commendations, and no formal recognition. Their experiences remained personal memories rather than historical facts. Over time, as these individuals aged, their stories became harder to verify, further reinforcing the absence within the archives. The silence extended beyond paperwork. Media briefings omitted certain timeframes. Congressional oversight committees received only partial disclosures. Even internal reviews sometimes referred to operations obliquely, using vague language that concealed more than it revealed. This was not negligence, it was policy. Silence, in these cases, was considered a form of protection. Protection of what? Often, it was protection of strategy, alliances, and plausible deniability. A mission without records could be denied if discovered. It could be disowned if it failed. It could be forgotten if its consequences became inconvenient. In a world where perception mattered as much as power, silence offered flexibility. But silence also has a cost. For historians, it creates gaps that cannot be filled with certainty. For families, it leaves unanswered questions. For the nation, it complicates the understanding of its own past. When archives are silent, history becomes fragmented, relying on inference rather than evidence. In recent decades, partial declassification has revealed how intentional this silence was. Documents have surfaced showing instructions to limit written communication. Memos reference activities not formally recorded. Files include notes indicating that certain materials were removed prior to archiving. These revelations confirm what many suspected: the silence was engineered. Yet, even these disclosures are incomplete. For every file released, others remain sealed. For every hint uncovered, entire narratives stay hidden. The silence persists, not as an absence of history, but as a barrier to it. The silence in the archives reminds us that history is not only written by those who act, but by those who decide what is preserved. In the case of certain U.S. military missions, the decision was clear. Some actions were meant to exist only in the moment they occurred. No record, no trail, no acknowledgement. And so, when historians encounter that silence today, they are not just facing missing documents. They are confronting deliberate erasure, a reminder that in the pursuit of security, even a nation built on record-keeping can choose to forget. That silence remains quiet, intentional, and unresolved. Why some missions leave no paper trail is a question that challenges the very foundation of how modern militaries are expected to operate. The United States military is known for its layered documentation systems, where even minor actions are recorded and reviewed. Yet, despite this structure, there are operations that were intentionally designed to disappear from official memory. This was not an accident of history, but a calculated approach shaped by urgency, risk, and necessity. At the core of this reality lies secrecy. Certain missions demanded a level of confidentiality that written records could not guarantee. Paper can be copied, files can be leaked, archives can eventually be opened. For operations considered too sensitive, the safest record was no record at all. In these cases, limiting documentation was seen as the strongest form of security. Emergency authorization played a major role. During moments of crisis, decisions were often made rapidly, sometimes outside normal chains of command. Verbal approval replaced written orders. Instructions were passed directly from commander to unit, bypassing standard reporting procedures. When time was critical, documentation became a liability rather than a safeguard. Deniable objectives further reinforced this practice. Some missions were structured so that the United States could plausibly deny involvement if exposed. Leaving a paper trail would undermine that deniability. If no formal record existed, responsibility could not be easily assigned. This allowed political leaders and military planners to act while maintaining distance from potential fallout. Classification alone was sometimes not enough. Even highly classified documents still exist somewhere, stored for possible future access. But for certain missions, existence itself was considered dangerous. These operations were not merely classified. They were intentionally undocumented. Records that were created temporarily were later removed, altered, or destroyed to ensure that no trace remained. Post-mission classification also contributed to the disappearance of records. In some cases, documentation was created but later absorbed into broader classified programs. Mission names were changed. Details were merged into unrelated files. Over time, individual operations lost their identity, becoming indistinguishable fragments within larger classified efforts. What remained was not a clear record, but a blurred outline. Another factor was the protection of personnel and methods. Certain missions relied on techniques, equipment, or partnerships that could not be exposed without compromising future operations. Writing these details down risked revealing capabilities to adversaries. By leaving no paper trail, planners ensured that even if something surfaced, it would lack the specificity needed to cause harm. There was also the matter of outcomes. Missions that succeeded quietly often remained undocumented because recognition was unnecessary and exposure undesirable. Missions that failed carried even greater risk. Failure could invite scrutiny, legal questions, or political consequences. In those cases, erasing records was sometimes seen as damage control. This absence of documentation had lasting effects on those involved. Participants were often instructed not to discuss their actions, not even internally. Their service records reflected routine assignments, masking the reality of what they had done. Over time, these individuals carried experiences that could not be officially acknowledged, reinforcing the silence. From an institutional perspective, this approach was justified as temporary. Silence was meant to last until the risk passed. But as years turned into decades, temporary secrecy became permanent absence. Files that were never created could never be released. Stories that were never written could never be confirmed. The lack of a paper trail also influenced historical understanding. Researchers attempting to reconstruct events encountered contradictions. Timelines did not align. Official records conflicted with personal accounts. Without documentation, historians were left to piece together fragments, often unable to reach definitive conclusions. Why were these choices accepted? Because in the context of national security, uncertainty was often preferable to exposure. Leaders believed that some truths were safer unrecorded. Silence offered flexibility, protection, and control over narrative. Yet this silence reshaped history. It removed certain actions from public memory. It denied recognition to those who served. It created gaps that can never be fully closed. The absence of records is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of intent. Why some missions leave no paper trail is ultimately about priorities. In moments of extreme risk, secrecy outweighed transparency, security outweighed history, and the result was a legacy of operations that existed only in action, not in archives. Those missions remain undocumented, not because they were insignificant, but because they were considered too significant to record. The human evidence that remains is often the only proof that a mission without records ever happened. When official documentation disappears, when archives fall silent, history does not vanish entirely. It survives in people, in memories and fragments of testimony, in behavior shaped by experiences that were never formally acknowledged. This human evidence is incomplete, fragile, and deeply personal, yet it carries a weight that no missing file can erase. For many who participated in such missions, silence was not optional. It was instructed, reinforced, and internalized. They were told not to discuss where they went, what they did, or who they worked with. Sometimes the instruction was explicit. Other times it was implied through consequences. Over time, that silence became habit. Even decades later, many veterans hesitate before speaking, carefully choosing words, pausing when memories surface that were never meant to be shared. What remains, then, are not reports, but recollections. A veteran recalls a deployment that never appears in his service history. A pilot remembers a flight path that does not match any training exercise. A unit member describes faces and places that have no official connection to his assigned role. These memories are often dismissed as anecdotal, yet when compared across individuals, patterns begin to emerge. Separate accounts describe similar timelines, similar procedures, similar environments. These consistencies form a kind of informal record, one written in shared experience rather than ink. The human evidence also appears in the gaps within personal histories. Families notice periods when letters stopped arriving. Children remember parents who returned changed, quieter, more guarded. Spouses recall unexplained absences followed by silence rather than stories. These are not dramatic revelations, but subtle markers of something unspoken. Oral histories, when collected years later, reveal the emotional cost of these missions. Participants often struggle to reconcile what they did with the lack of acknowledgement. Without records, there is no official validation, no confirmation that their service mattered. No recognition of risk or sacrifice. This absence shapes identity, leaving some feeling invisible within the very institution they served. The human evidence also includes hesitation. When asked direct questions, some veterans deflect. Others say only that they can't talk about it. Even when legal restrictions expire, the habit of silence remains. This reluctance itself becomes evidence, an indication that something occurred which still feels protected even after time has passed. In some cases, fragments of physical evidence intersect with human memory. An old photograph without labels, equipment that does not match documented assignments, medals awarded quietly without citation. These objects raise questions that official records do not answer, relying instead on personal explanation. Historians who study these missions often rely on interviews rather than documents. They listen for repetition, for shared language, for overlapping experiences. They note emotional responses as much as factual details. A pause before answering, a change in tone, a story told carefully, as if rehearsed over years of restraint. The human evidence that remains is also shaped by loss. Some participants never lived long enough to speak. Others took their stories with them out of loyalty or fear. As time passes, The number of first-hand witnesses diminishes, making the remaining voices even more significant. This creates urgency. Each unrecorded memory that fades represents a permanent loss of historical insight. Without documents, memory becomes the archive. And memory, unlike paper, is vulnerable. Yet, despite this vulnerability, human evidence persists. It persists because experiences leave marks. They shape decisions, reactions, and perspectives. Veterans of undocumented missions often demonstrate heightened caution, strong bonds with certain individuals, and an acute awareness of risk. These traits are not random. They reflect lived reality. The absence of records also affects how these individuals relate to history itself. Many express frustration when official narratives omit events they know occurred. Others accept the silence as part of their duty. For them, the lack of acknowledgement is not a failure, but a confirmation of how sensitive their mission truly was. In this way, human evidence becomes both proof and burden. It proves that something happened, and it burdens those who remember it. Unlike official records, human evidence cannot be easily accessed, verified, or preserved. It requires trust. It requires listening. It requires the willingness to accept that history does not always come neatly documented. The human evidence that remains reminds us that history is not only written in archives, it is carried by people. When records are erased, memory becomes resistance against forgetting. It becomes the last line of preservation. These missions may have no records, but they are not without witnesses. And as long as someone remembers, the silence is never complete.